Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we explore the intersection of gender and politics in the context of Donald Trump's re-election. Our guest, Dr. Nicole Bourbonnais, Associate Professor of International History and Politics and co-director of the Gender Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute, offers her insights on how gender dynamics influenced the election outcomes. We discuss the significance of Susie Wiles' appointment as the first woman White House Chief of Staff and the broader implications of Trump's woman cabinet picks. Additionally, we examine the impact of the overturning of Roe v. Wade on the gender voting gap and its effects on the election results. Dr. Bourbonnais also shares her perspectives on the potential international repercussions of Trump's election for gender dynamics and what we can expect from gender equality advocates during his second term. Join us for a thought-provoking conversation that sheds light on the critical role of gender in contemporary politics. So Nicole, it's great to have you back on What Matters Today. Thank you for joining us in this episode. I'm just going to go into these questions because I think there's a lot to unpack since the election. So how did gender shape the election?
Sure. Thanks, Dan, for having me. I think we can talk about maybe two things separately. So first, the campaign itself, and then the election results. So obviously, during the campaign, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that Kamala Harris, if elected, would be the first woman president. A lot of the Democrats talked a lot about reproductive rights. But I think we should also keep in mind that Trump also ran a very gendered campaign, right? He really locked into this kind of renegade, anti-establishment, pretty blatantly misogynistic brand of masculinity. And he made a point actually in this election, especially of engaging with kind of contemporary bro culture, right? So going on the Joe Rogan podcast, engaging with MMA circles, that kind of thing. At the same time, the social conservatives within the Republican Party continued to advance an also very gendered program of social policy, right? One which centers around restoring the so-called traditional family, defined as Christian, heterosexual, with a male breadwinner, head of household, and a wife focused on reproduction. And Trump also sometimes kind of plays into this discourse, right? So he talked about, at one point, about protecting women, that he would protect women, this kind of benevolent patriarch kind of position. Now, on the surface, these seem like very contradictory discourses, right? I mean, how can you, on the one hand, brag about assaulting women, and on the other hand, say that you're going to protect them? But I think what they both share is, in both cases, it's centered around male power and the upholding of masculine power. I think the fact that when Trump said that he would protect women, he said he would protect them whether they like it or not, is very telling in that sense. Now, as for the election results themselves, I think it's pretty hard at this point to tease out exactly how gender shaped the way that people voted so soon after the election. And I think there's often this quick jump to conclusions based on the sex disaggregated data, which we got from the exit polls, right? So obviously, the early exit polls showed that the vast majority of Black women voted for Kamala. And then there's this kind of leap like, oh, well, it's because she's a woman of color. But actually, the percentage is almost the same as they voted for Biden, right? So there's a continuity there. As well, the fact that more white women voted for Trump than Kamala, this is something that's gotten a lot of press. But again, white women have voted more for Republicans than Democrats for the last 70 years, with only a couple of exceptions. So in that way, it's actually a continuity. Now, why that is and why the gender discourse of Trump didn't dissuade that or didn't influence, I think is something that we'll have to wait until there's actually, qualitative analysis, interviews with voters to try and understand what the thought process were. Maybe one interesting thing from the exit polls that could also prompt kind of more research is the increasing divide between young men and young women, right? So young men drifting more Republican than in the past, young women drifting more Democrat. And that's something, again, we won't know exactly why that is for a while, but it could be a really interesting research agenda.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Susie Wiles will be the first woman White House Chief of Staff. Now, Trump also has several other women in his cabinet picks so far. Is this a win for women?
Yeah, so this is definitely an argument that I've heard put forth recently, that the fact that Trump has put women in positions of power is a win for women, or that it somehow counters some of the other, problems with his kind of gender policy. And look, there's certainly a brand of feminism that sees individual empowerment, getting women into positions in power as the main goal, right? We might call this a power feminism or a neoliberal feminism. And this is a version of feminism that has dominated in a lot of American popular culture. So you can see that kind of girl power sort of narrative.
Yeah.
But I think most feminist traditions, socialist feminism, intersectional feminism, community feminism, have a much more collective goal in mind, right? The idea is not just to improve the situation of a few women, but to end sexism, sexist exploitation, gender oppression, rigid gender hierarchies for everyone, right? So the goal is then not just to break the glass ceiling for the sake of breaking the glass ceiling, but break the glass ceiling so that you can build a new and better ceiling, or, break the glass ceiling so you can start building a new house.
Right.
So kind of, as a step in the process.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to think more about why and under what conditions would having more women in power be a step towards that larger process of building a better society. Now, obviously, there's the kind of essentialist argument that women are naturally more peaceful or naturally, better listeners. And so therefore, having more of them in power will promote those kinds of goals, more peaceful, more collaborative rule. I don't find it super convincing. I think, maybe there are some natural tendencies, but I think if you know more than 4 women, you probably know one who doesn't fit that stereotype. So that's not a super strong argument to me. Another argument could be that, well, whatever our natural traits, women have been assigned certain positions in society that and have been socialized, right, in certain ways. Often, for example, taking on more caretaking duties and being raised to listen more. We've faced certain forms of discrimination that, might lead us to have a different view of society, might allow us to bring a different kind of approach, right? This is sort of the concept of what scholars would call situated knowledge, that, your knowledge, your understanding of society is shaped by where you are positioned in it. And so therefore, you could bring a different perspective. And that is a bit more convincing, but at the same time, one's personal experience might still be quite narrow, right? We know that many women who reach leadership positions are women who were already members of the elite, right, or the dominant social group. They may not have faced the same kind of experiences as the average woman, right? Or they might have struggled quite a bit and have the sense of like, well, I struggled and I still got here, so there must not be a problem, right? This is something you also get. So I think for having women in positions of power to bring a larger kind of feminist change, you need someone who brings not only their personal perspective, but also a broader understanding of the way gender hierarchies work, how they intersect with other structures like race, class, other inequalities, and who also have a desire to change the system in a more structural way, right? Yeah. And even if you come to positions of power with this feminist consciousness, it's still pretty hard to promote that change if you're like 1 or 2 women within an establishment that's still largely, patriarchal or dominated by those goals. Political scientists sometimes talk about the need for like a critical mass in order to really change an institution. So basically, that's a very long answer. But to make a long story short, I do think there are contexts in which having women in positions of power could be valuable towards that larger collective feminist goal. But I don't really think that context applies in the case of the current Trump administration.
So what role did the overturning of Roe v. Wade have in shaping the election?
Yeah, so this is quite interesting. You and I, of course, had a discussion about this about 2 years ago when the Dobbs decision first overturned Roe v. Wade and the right to privacy that had protected abortion access. And as predicted, a number of restrictive abortion laws have been passed. Abortion is now banned in almost all cases in over a dozen states. A number of others have very tight gestational limits or in the process of navigating bans that have been kind of temporarily blocked by the courts. Now, one interesting thing to mention here is that the most recent data shows the rate of abortions has actually increased slightly since the Dobbs decision. And this is at least in part due to the very rapid expansion in the past few years of the market for the abortion pill.
Right.
So you might remember we talked a bit about the method and how it can be used, safely within the home, particularly in the first couple months of pregnancy. There's a super interesting new book out by Carrie Baker on the history of the abortion pill. And she traces how, there were these longer networks that have spread it among women's groups. Also, the turn to telemedicine during COVID, which made it possible, to be sent in the mail and you could receive guidance from a physician online. But this has really taken off since Dobbs. The price has dropped dramatically. There's many websites where you can get the pill. A number of states have also passed provider protection laws, so basically allowing a doctor in a state where there is no abortion ban to prescribe the pill to someone in a state with a ban and be able to be protected from prosecution. But this is not to say that the law didn't have a huge impact, right? This option, again, is really only viable in the first few months, so it's for earlier pregnancies. What we've seen in many of the states with total bans is that women who have life-threatening complications in the second term or later, or who have, fetuses with no chance of survival, and yet they're being forced to carry the pregnancy to term, or sometimes, being denied care until they're really on their deathbed.
Right. Yeah.
There's been fatalities, women dying from it. Also women who are having miscarriages and then not getting the proper care because there's this concern among physicians that they could be held liable, right? So there is a huge impact. And these bans have not been very popular actually among Americans, right? Even before Dobbs, surveys showed only a slim portion of the American public supported these kinds of total bans, usually around 5 to 10%, depending on the study.
Okay.
Vast majority of Americans think abortion should be legal in at least some cases. Over 60% think it should be illegal in most cases or all cases, right? So. Okay. And in fact, you've seen also a rise since Dobbs in those who think it should be legal in all cases, right? Perhaps as we see the really negative effects of these laws in practice. Among those who voted for Kamala, abortion was one of their top 5 concerns, at least according to the exit polls. So you can see that this was really on the minds of a lot of voters. But even among Republicans, there was definitely during the Trump campaign, he backed off a bit on the abortion issue, right? So he kind of said, well, I did what I could by putting in the Supreme Court. Now it's up to the states. At one point, he said that he would not sign a federal abortion ban, although, of course, he's also said many other contradictory things. So it's hard to really know what will go on there. But what we can definitely expect is that Republican legislators will go after the abortion pills, right? So they've talked about trying to reverse the FDA's approval of the pills, or using the 19th century Comstock law, which restricts the sending of obscene materials through post, which was actually the premise on which birth control was basically illegal in the past, but using that for the abortion pill. And so this will continue to be a major subject, I think, both domestically and also internationally.
Now, on the topic of internationally, what do you see as the potential impacts of Trump's election for gender dynamics internationally?
So first of all, continuing on the theme of abortion, Trump will definitely reinstate the Mexico City policy or global gag rule. As you'll remember, this is a policy that was first implemented in 1985, which stipulates that any organizations that receive U.S. funds for family planning assistance cannot perform abortions, provide referrals for abortion, or advocate for abortion access. And this policy was rescinded by Democrat governments, re-implemented by every Republican government since then. It was in the last Trump government, so we can expect he will bring it back. And the Republicans have also talked about expanding it further to cover more forms of aid. This has a huge impact globally. The U.S. is a major funder for international health and development. And again, it will impact not only the provision of abortion services, but any organizations that provide family planning or other kinds of care if they have any kind of links to abortion. Now, during his last administration as well, the U.S. signed, along with 35 other states, the so-called Geneva Consensus Declaration on Promoting Women's Health and Strengthening the Family, which is a document basically drawing on international mechanisms to stress that there's no international right to abortion and to stress state sovereignty on matters related to the family. It's connected to a kind of global promotion of the kind of heterosexual nuclear family. And we can expect that the US will rejoin that
Right.
consensus
Yeah.
and also collaborate with other regimes in the United Nations who are really actively working right now to block any language around gender, sexual rights, or reproductive health in really any international agreements, right? So not just things about gender specifically, but agreements on health, agreements on environment, trade, whatever. There's this group of countries that are basically not signing on to anything if it has these words in it. Now, these might seem like quite benign terms, but for these states, gender equals or gender equality are basically seen as code words for gender identity or
Right.
transgender.
Right.
Sexual rights is seen as a code for queer activism. Reproductive health is seen as a code word for abortion.
Right,
Now,
okay.
that's not the actual definitions of those
Right,
terms,
of course.
but it's part of this kind of general transnational movement that's increasingly converged around this language of fighting quote unquote gender ideology, which is heavily supported by Russia for one, and also by really wealthy conservative American foundations as well. Now, these are the most explicitly gendered policies that we can expect to see. But we also need to recognize that even policies that are not specifically about gender or reproductive rights can have particular implications for gender and reproductive well-being, especially if we take a broad scope. So, for example, the framework of reproductive justice highlights the need not only for access to abortion, contraception, but also the right to have children, to a safe pregnancy, to postpartum care, and a conducive social environment for raising a family. And these rights would be undermined, for example, by Trump's plans for mass deportations, which will likely lead again to the separation of families across borders. Now, scholars have also highlighted the way ongoing conflicts around the world often harden gender roles and can have particular implications for reproductive well-being. Birth rates have dropped dramatically in the Ukraine in the context of the current war. In Palestine, obviously, pregnancy and childbirth are very dangerous at the moment. The very reproductive viability of a community is at stake here, both under the current assault and also in the longer-term occupation. Even peace processes are often gendered. For example, there is a tendency for women and women's organizations to be excluded from official conflict resolution processes, even when they often do a great deal of peace-building work on the ground. Now, what influence Trump has on these conflicts, what approach he will take, I think remains to be seen. But I think when we assess the impact of his foreign policies on gender and reproduction, we need to also be thinking about these perhaps kind of less direct or obvious elements.
Thanks for that. And for my final question, what can we expect to see from gender equality advocates in Trump's second term?
Well, feminists have always worked in multiple spaces, right? Both within and outside of governments and institutions. But I think as some of those internal mechanisms get closed off, we'll probably see more public and oppositional forms of mobilization. You might remember that last time Trump was elected, there was a mass women's march on the Capitol.
Right. Yeah.
And it looks like there is now a feminist-led People's March Day of Action planned for January 18th. In DC and everywhere. So the idea is to have, a march in DC, but also to have actions in other areas of the United States. I think the change in label from Women's March to Feminist-led People's March is very interesting. And I think it reflects that awareness I was saying about connecting to other issues and seeing all of these issues as united. In this case, the march is a day of action against fascism, is the kind of uniting principle behind it, which is quite interesting. I think you'll also see an expansion of feminist networks. Certainly in response to Dobbs, there's been, for example, the growth of funds that are helping women to pay for abortion pills or to travel out of state. I think these kinds of things will only grow. There will be legal challenges across the board, not only to, further restrictions on reproductive rights, but also on things like mass deportation.
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be challenges throughout. We're also seeing mobilization on the international level already. So a number of states have indicated their plans to step up and try and fill some of the funding gaps around reproductive health. There are already communities here in Geneva also starting to get coordinated against this state hostility to gender in the international fora. And there are many international organizations and NGOs that are really directly linking their concerns to a broader struggle against authoritarian kind of rule. So In short, I guess, at the risk of kind of stating the obvious, there will be turbulent times ahead, I'm sure, in the new year.
Well, that's a perfect way to end this podcast. So thank you once again for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today.
Thanks, Dan.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.